Hello, Nrvc folks. I'm happy to be with you today doing this pre-recorded event talk ahead of our live workshop next week. We've got a couple of things that we're going to share with you today as you watch this in teams. Maybe watch it individually. Hopefully you're getting a chance to be together though and think about the impact of what we're going to be, what we've been learning here at Springtide, what I'm going to be sharing with you on the kind of ministry that you do with young people. I think a lot of what young people are telling us at Springtide has some pretty clear implications for the way that we traditionally do the youth groups, campus ministries, how we do small group and family ministries, Bible studies, etc. Um, when I was growing up, I remember fondly that it was sort of like these days of sort of like large program events that every even though I could see through a little bit, see behind the Wizard of Oz curtain, that they were just throwing a big party to get me to show up to this thing, um, so they could get to talk to me about God. I didn't care. I was in for that. I was happy to be a part of that situation. Um, and I'm not, that old. Although my 11-year-old son uh, would vehemently disagree that I'm not old. But at 43, I feel like that wasn't so long ago that I was 14, 15, 16 years old and going to youth group events that were largely based on that program-driven model. And how quickly times have changed. I mean, what we're seeing from young people, both in last year's State of Religion and Young People Report, and in this year's, which I cover here, is just a really clear indication that that's not what they're interested in. And part of that is COVID, of course, like gathering in large groups and whatnot is maybe a little bit more dicey than it was previously, but it's not all COVID. And a lot of that, we were starting to see signs of this move away from program driven ministry well before the pandemic. Starting to see that a call for more of a relational approach, that the distrust inherent in young people's relationships with and experiences with institutions means that they're not so, they want you to sort of show proof. The burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that you have their best interest in mind, I guess, is one way to say it, as opposed to just being able to assume it because we think, generally that the church is a good place to be. It's a pretty, that is a stark change from how many of us grew up, and has, I think, really calls us to re-examine a lot of the ways that we do things. I think the really good thing, though, that's present in all the data that we've collected, 23 some thousand data points in surveys alone over the last couple of years, is that we don't see young people asking you to compromise your beliefs. In fact, they really want you to show up with integrity in these spaces, and to when the time is right to share what you believe with them, and to help guide them in ways that help them ask the right questions so they can figure out what they believe. Um, and that's good. I mean, I think that largely what this means is that there's a whole lot that's up for grabs. There's a whole lot about how we do ministry, how we engage with young people, how we guide them, that can really be changed, without having to change the substance of what you do with young people, and without having to compromise the care and concern and genuine passion that you bring, um, to these roles. So, what we've got for you today, I'm going to share with you a few different things. So, number one, I'm going to share with you the first look webinar that we just did for the State of Religion and Young People for 2021, and you're going to see that coming up first, and then I'll pop back in and help make the transition over into this second thing that I want to share, which is all about the new normal. And the new normal is a report that we put out about helping young people sort of guide them out of the pandemic, and it has these 8 exercises in empathy that help for us to, as adults, to sort of remember what it's like to be young, and then to also combine with the data to not just remember what it's like to be young, but to know what it's like to be young and thinking about all those experiences um, through an actual pandemic. And one of the exciting things that I'm really glad to be able to bring to this event this year, is that throughout these videos, what you're going to see is actual voices of young people. I mean, it's you would be surprised at the number of conferences that I get invitations to speak to, or speak at rather, that are really about young people, but no young people's voices are represented there. we really want to make sure that we are not contributing to that at Springtide. And so not only do young people's voices, of course, show up in how they inform our data, but you're going to hear from actual young people throughout this next 90 minutes of presentation, and in ways that help both illustrate but also to dive deeper into the sort of cares and concerns with young people. And they're not, and I think what's really interesting is like these are not data points. Like when you see young people talking on video, that's not data. It's not collected systematically. They're speaking out of their own personal experience. They're not speaking broadly. But in some ways, it like helps to bring that data to life. It helps us to understand what we see in these big national trends. Because I think always the question that I have when I see data is like, oh, okay, that's a percentage, from Pew or whomever, Springtide. But what does that look like? How do I know that when I see it? Like, what does that look like in a young person's life that I'm encountering? What are they going to say that helps me to understand that it's really part of this larger thing that's going on in the world? And that's where I think that these stories and video clips of young people talking about their own personal experiences are just so absolutely critical. And I think and hope that you'll find them to be illuminating in that regard as well. Okay, so I'm gonna pause right here, and we'll move into the webinar, and I'll come back and transition this over into the new normal here in a little bit. All right, see you soon. This is the State of Religion in Young People 2021. This is Springtide's flagship study. We do this every single year to try and capture what we've been learning and hearing from young people in that given calendar year about their religious and spiritual concerns, their engagement with the divine, their feelings about institutional religion, whether they do or don't go to church or mosque or synagogue, if they engage in some sort of rituals and practices. All of that we want to wrap up into an annual report. And of course, every year is a little bit different. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what we learned last year, and then what we've discovered this year in this first look webinar here. Before we get too far into that, though, for those of you who are new to Springtide, I just want to say a little bit about who we are. Springtide is a research institute that it's national. We focus on 13 to 25-year-olds across the country, and as we sometimes say in a shorthand way, we go wherever they are asking and trying to navigate life's biggest questions. We show up there and we talk to them. We find out what their concerns are, who their influences are, who they're turning to. We pay attention to who they're not paying attention to, and ask questions about that too. We do this all in a very sociological perspective. So we're trying to always dig for the deeper story, the broader lens, contextualize the data points. As we say here in our mission statement, we believe that no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. So we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. If you're showing up here today, you almost certainly you're one of those people who cares about young people, and certainly we cannot and do not need to change how much you care. But sometimes we're working with inaccurate information, and in order to care best, we need to understand really what's going on in the lives of young people. And that's our job at Springtide, is to bring you an accurate understanding of the world that young people inhabit, so that you can see where you might be able to make an impact in their lives, because they really need you. In that first segment, you see that we believe no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone, and increasingly that's what they're doing. As we're going to see, and as those of you who have been following along with our work already know probably, young people are just often disconnected from the kinds of institutions that many of us on this call might have grown up with, and the trusted adults that came along with those institutions and acted as guides often feel disconnected from the young people that they would like to impact. And that's because the world has changed, and we need to find new ways of bridging those gaps. At Springtide, the way that we want to do that is through this particular way of doing research that we call data with heart. So yes, we're going to collect a lot of data. You're going to see a lot of data. We have the largest data set in the country about young people's religious and spiritual concerns. But for us, it's more than just interviews and qualitative data, and it's more than just surveys and quantitative data and numbers. We are intensely listening to young people throughout the research process in a number of ways. We have a young person's advisory board. We have a national research advisory board of experts who work with young people and care about them. We have interns, we have a writer in residence program, we have a BIPOC fellowship, and all this is designed at Springtide to make sure that we don't just become a bunch of old people studying young people. We want to be rigorous with our data, but we want to make sure that that data has heart. And it's those perspectives that make sure that our data has heart. And we're always feeding back like, hey, what about this question? Could we ask this? Are we understanding these data in the correct way? Those are the overriding concerns that Springtide has, is not just collecting the data in a way that is rigorous, but understanding and then interpreting it and getting it out into the world in a way that young people can see themselves in our data when we tell those stories. And we have a whole lot of data. To date, we've gathered 230 qualitative interviews and 22,000 nearly survey responses and 16 focus groups. Most people get really blown away by the survey number, the 22,000 responses. But of course, if you've ever tried to talk to a young person on the phone, you know it's the 230 qualitative interviews that are far more impressive, as our research team has done just an amazing job over the last couple of years, really tracking down young people, getting them to talk about their deepest concerns on the phone with a stranger. One of my favorite sitcoms to come out in recent years is Superstore, and there's this line in there from somebody who is one of the actresses from this demographic, and she turns to her friend and she says, I feel like calling someone is like the meanest thing you can do to them. So getting all of these interviews is no small feat. And this year, informing the state of religion in young people is just over 10,000 surveys and about 125 of those 230 interviews that we collected just this year for this study. And if you were here last year, you remember that we offered up this concept of relational authority in the State of Religion in Young People 2020. You can still find this. It's free download on our website, or if you want the physical copy, you can buy it from us or from Amazon, I think for just $10, or maybe even, I think I saw it for $7 at Amazon the other day. And we were able to use the data to drive actionable insights about how to connect and engage with young people in a way that they would find most productive. And that model that emerged out of the quantitative and qualitative data was this thing that we called relational authority, combining listening, transparency, integrity, and care along with expertise to really make a difference, to gain trust, and to move the needle with the young people in your lives. So often adults feel like we have to just come in with the expertise. We have to, and it's not just that we feel like that's our role. Sometimes, I mean, we actually do know what's best for young people, and so we want to tell it to them as soon as we possibly can, so their lives can get better. And that makes a lot of sense, except that if we're not doing the listening, transparency, integrity, and care parts, the expertise just really doesn't matter. We don't get through to them. And if we're only doing the listening, transparency, integrity, and care, we're not bringing any expertise to the table, well, young people just sort of dismiss us. We look like friends to them, and they don't need us to be their friends. They were very upfront that they are looking for adults to be adults. And they wanted more trusted adults and need more trusted adults in their lives. And if you're interested in that, of course, you can probably find recordings of me talking about it online somewhere. I've done a lot of that, or you can download the report. And this year, the State of Religion and Young People, which will be out October 22nd, I think it just is coming to us from the printer today, which is exciting, and I can't wait to see it in actual physical form. But this year is all about navigating uncertainty. If you know anything, if you've been doing anything other than hibernating over the last couple of years, you know that uncertainty is the hallmark of what people have been going through. And what's weird about navigating uncertainty through a pandemic is that, especially for young people, like, how do you figure out what's normal and what's not normal? Because uncertainty is always a part of being young. In fact, maybe the defining feature of being young, you could argue, is exploration and curiosity, and like trying to figure things out and not really knowing who you are or where you stand, or, you know, maybe even what you should be, what you want to do. Well, that's one thing. Just to be a normal 18, 19, 20-year-old is just one thing. But to do that and not even know if the kind of uncertainty that you're feeling is the kind that you're supposed to be feeling or should be, that's a whole other thing, because we've had this pandemic layered on top of it. And so what we wanted to do this year is really dig into, what does that uncertainty look like in young people's lives? And most importantly, how are they navigating it, especially when it comes to their religious and spiritual concerns? Because so many of the questions that have come to bear over the last year and a half for young people, and for maybe all of us, have been questions that are religious in nature. What is the meaning of all of this? What is the impact of this on my life? What, including like, well, how much should I be consuming? Like, did I just spent a year not shopping or very much? Is that a thing I should keep doing? What's going on with the environment? What role does racial justice play in my life and in the world? And on and on and on. We explored this year through not just questions of values, but also through questions of work and vocation. We explored this through transitions back to school in some of our publications, a new normal and work life. And we're exploring it here specifically with regard to faith. And before we move on into that, I want to give a plug for season 5 of the Voices of Young People podcast. If you follow along with Springtide, you know that every time we release a report, we also have an accompanying season of the podcast, The Voices of Young People, that comes out with it. Our head of community, Marta Awaji, is the producer for this. It's fantastic. I love especially the seasons that come with the state of religion and young people, because it's just a young person talking about how these issues impact their lives and their faith. There's no interviewer voice, and it's a really diverse set of people that are coming at this from a variety of angles. And so for many of us that don't necessarily, maybe wouldn't get exposed to a broad array of young people, we get a chance to hear those stories. They'll be coming out, I think they either start this week or next week. I can't remember the exact launch date. Maybe we can get it over there in the chat. And by the way, in the chat, I'm seeing people talk about the ways that they've been using our work and are using our work in their own settings. That's amazing. That's incredibly gratifying. And I'm certainly we're going to capture those for the team. So thank you. 10/21 is the date of the new podcast release. I see there from Sigrid. Thanks a lot. Anyway, please do give us a like, give us a follow, leave a review of the podcast. That helps other people to find it and discover young people. So look, a lot of the context of this year of navigating uncertainty happens, we can't tell that story without telling the broader context of what's going on in the world. And of course, as those of you who have seen previous presentations know, one of the big things that's been happening in the world for the last 40 or 50 years is this loss of trust in social institutions, not just for adults, as you see here, but also for young people. When this is Springtide's data, at Springtide, all the data that we collect is 13 to 25-year-olds. And even here, nothing really gets above a 5 on a 10-point scale, or very high above a 5 on a 10-point scale. And so that's a key thing that is still happening in young people's lives. It's not like, I know we talked about it in depth last year, but it's not like just because we talked about it, that goes away. That still is an important contextual piece. And going all the way back to Springtide's first study at the beginning of 2020, called Belonging, we explored social isolation among young people, and that still remains the case. Gen Z is the loneliest generation, not just right now, but ever recorded. That is not typically the case. It's usually the oldest cohort that is the loneliest and the most isolated. And for the first time ever, it's young people. And so you've got massive institutional distrust along with social isolation. Those two things are not happening in parallel. They're of course connected. I mean, when you're disconnected from institutions, you end up being disconnected from a lot of people. And we add into that mix data from this year about uncertainty. 40% of young people say that they have experienced trauma in their lives. 62% have experienced a broader term called emotional distress as a result of a challenging event. And 28% reported experiencing a challenging event that was causing them to feel uncertainty when they took our survey. So what that means, and we gave the survey all throughout the year, so what that means essentially is that somewhere around a fourth to a third of young people are experiencing some kind of combination of uncertainty, trauma, stress at any given time. That if you've got 3 or 4 young people in front of you, there's a really good chance that one of them is going through something that needs to be attended to in that exact moment. And there are real spiritual implications of living in this environment. This world that young people are trying to navigate, where, among other things, this is not everything that's going on in their life, but I think these are the 3 really big hallmark keystone things that are shaping all of the other parts of their lives. Low trust, high isolation, and massive uncertainty. So in the midst of that, of course, they're trying to do all the normal young people things. They're trying to go to school. They're trying to get jobs. They're trying to form relationships, romantic relationships, friendship relationships, and they're trying to navigate through all of that in what I think are really unprecedented circumstances. It's not uncommon for generations to have to navigate one or maybe two of these things, but it's pretty rare for for an entire generation of young people to have to grow up trying to find their way through this combination of massive things happening all at the same time. So while we might say it's just a thing like a pandemic, underneath the surface of that, there are all these social forces that are running through the currents that are running through their lives. And one of the really encouraging things for us at Springtide to see is that there still remains like fairly high rates of religiosity and spirituality. So you see there roughly 3/4 of young people um, say that they're religious. 78% of young people say that they're spiritual. Now, of course, the context of that, though, um, it looks a little bit different. So the majority of young people are religious or spiritual, but what do they believe? And so we asked them to identify with these statements, like which one is the closest to their own reality. And you see, something like 16% of them are functionally falling into this atheist category, that they don't believe in a higher power at all. And 7% are I don't know, but we see over 50% say that they either believe more than they doubt, or that light green 23% saying that they have no doubts that a higher power exists. I find this to be a sort of not astonishing, but I think encouraging that there is at least some sense that, as we talked about last year, the decoupling of these affiliation variables, like, do you identify as Christian, Catholic, Christian, Protestant, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, etc. Just because you're unwilling to check those boxes doesn't mean you don't believe and aren't interested. Because we see about 40+% of young people being unaffiliated. So it's this whole mix where belief is really varied, and also belief and affiliation are not particularly connected. It's also true that belief and connection to a higher power are not necessarily synonymous. So we asked just the young people who said that they believed in a higher power, do you feel connected to that higher power? And you see there, like a third of young people say not at all. Like, yes, I think there is a higher power, but they don't have any personal connection to the divine, which is, I think, a very interesting space to occupy. And probably one that would cause no small amount of cognitive dissonance that I imagine, needing help to try and make it through. That's okay. I mean, one of the things to really understand here is that young people's lives are marked by change, as we noted earlier, and exploration. And so I don't know that this would cause this pie chart here would cause quite so much concern among young people who are used to sort of living with this notion of both knowing and not knowing, being and becoming, as it would maybe with adults who feel like they need to be formed completely and have figured things out and mostly just live those things out. Young people don't seem to be as bothered by this as adults. So what does that look like when when our young people talk about that? As we noted, we've done a whole lot of interviews, and here's a quote from Viola, who's 17. In real life, then that kind of those pie charts translate into things like this. Sometimes I found it really hard to identify with Christianity because of other Christians. And I know that's not necessarily right, because people are not always an accurate representation of the whole and of the belief. But I live in a really small town in a rural area, and it can be really discouraging at times to have to identify with part of a church that I really disagree with at times. I don't currently attend a church, but I'll listen to sermons online and stuff, and I do some smaller Bible studies with friends. There's a whole lot going on in these 3 short paragraphs from Viola that I think is worth unpacking throughout the course of this conversation today. And so I want you to sort of keep those things in mind. I mean, what have we got here? We've got a 17-year-old, so a high school student, who is both being self-reflective enough to know that she's engaging in this sort of like, I don't want to be there, even though I know that they're not representative of the faith as a whole, but it still makes it hard for you to engage with the faith as a whole. I mean, that's a level of self-reflection that a lot of adults don't always carry with them. Still being relatively committed to her faith and even to the practices of the faith, despite not being in the institutions or not wanting to identify and affiliate with those institutions. So listening to sermons online, attending Bible studies with friends, etc. I think Viola gives us a good snapshot of what this can look like in real life. On the quantitative side, again, we asked young people, do you try hard to carry your religious beliefs into all of your other dealings in life? And we see a very mixed bag here as well. So 39% of young people disagreed with this statement, 47% agreed, 14% don't even know. So that belief is not necessarily even coupled with action in daily life. Disrupting some of the assumptions that I think we might have about how committed young people are to their faith. That we've got this 47% of young people who are agreeing with that. But this was challenged during the pandemic. There was a real, the pandemic brought with it a real opportunity, but also some real troubles when it came to figuring out how to engage young people in conversations about religion. And we wrote this entire guide called The New Normal. You can see it behind me. We felt really good about that subtitle, about calling it the 8 ways to engage with Gen Z in a post-pandemic world. We felt good about that post-pandemic language when we wrote that subtitle in February, marketing this as a back-to-school guide. And of course, we're still in the pandemic. Nevertheless, the exercises in empathy there that Ellen, our head writer, came up with are fantastic. And they really help to connect our experiences with young people's experiences through the data and what young people are telling us. And one of the things that we were really encouraged by is that the young people's faith, at least for the first year and a half of the pandemic, seems to be doing okay. 47% say that their faith remains steady, and then about a split, about half of the remaining saying that they are doubting their faith more or lost their faith completely, and some saying that it got stronger. I get concerned about how long can that hold before it starts to slip without institutional support. So with the pandemic still coming in these fits and starts about who's comfortable showing up in which places and how, and with social distancing still being around, and with the Delta variant bringing it back, and who knows what other variants coming down the pike. But at least for now, it has not been catastrophic. In terms of people's faith, it's been catastrophic in so many ways. I don't mean to short sell it there, but it has not been catastrophic in terms of the bottom falling out on young people's faith lives. And so I think we can take some heart that just because young people are increasingly exploring and living faith outside of institutions doesn't mean that it's necessarily unsustainable, at least for short periods of time. And Yadi says it this way. He says, faith teaches you that no matter what happens, everything's going to be okay. And faith itself can really pull you through. And it gives us something to look forward to, a destination. And I just feel like it's very, very important. Really, some of these key ways of making it through all this uncertainty, that it's going to be okay. We are going to pull through this. And we saw this when we asked young people explicitly about uncertainty. Well, the majority of them are concerned about it. They are also confident. So they are, it's like something like 2/3 of young people are very concerned about the levels of stress and uncertainty in their life. And about the same amount of people are also confident that it will be okay. They are going to find their way through it. Which speaks, I think, to their resilience. But all of this navigation and outside of institutions and this sort of cognitive dissonance between believing but not always knowing where to put that belief, or sort of exploring and not even necessarily knowing where to put that exploration, has real spiritual implications, because that work is often being done alone. So we asked young people, when you felt overwhelmed and didn't know what to do about something, who did you turn to for help? Now, not surprisingly, friends and family show up at the top. I don't think that's ever going to change. We've got decades of research from social scientists, as well as other research institutes, to show how important families are and remain in young people's lives. I mean, parents are still, to the extent that parents are intact and present in young people's lives, they are still the single greatest source of influence, and friends being, a close second there. But we used to think of religious communities as playing this really important role, and young people just don't see religious communities as being the people that they should turn to anymore. You see, there is often likely to turn to nobody to help them navigate a stressful time as they are to turn to somebody from their faith community. About 16% of them selected those. They could have picked all of these options. It's not like they had to pick one or just the other. And we see teachers outranking somebody from their faith community. I don't think this is inherently a problem in the sense that like all those are good people, like your friends are good people, your parents are good people, your teachers are good people. But if we're talking about trying to make it through a world with that is like forcing real existential kinds of questions about the meaning of life, like the one that young people are living in right now, and they're not turning to faith leaders, well, then I do think that that's a problem. I mean, teachers are great. They don't do the same things that faith leaders do. Parents are great. They don't do the same things that faith leaders do. There's no reason why all these numbers couldn't be high. They did, again, they could have picked every one of them. And so I think that's where we start to see some of this erosion in the foundation. When we ask young people why not turn to a faith leader? A lot of this came down to values. So we're going to talk a little bit about this disconnect here that young people see between themselves and religious people and religious leaders. We ask them, how much do you care one of the things we ask them is, how much do you care about these particular issues? And you see that there, their level of care in the light green bar on top. And then we ask them, how much do you think religious people care about these issues? And you see their answer there in the dark green bar for each of these topics. And then that orange bar documents the disconnect for each of these. So you see there's a 27% disconnect, a 27-point disconnect for LGBTQA plus rights, a 25% disconnect, 25-point disconnect for gender equity, and on and on. In other words, young people are running around the country thinking like, I care a lot about gender equity, LGBTQ plus rights, immigration rights, income inequality, disability rights, environmental causes, reproductive rights, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, gun reform, and on. They don't think that religious people care about those things, any of those things, to the same level that they care about those things. And so when we interview and talk to young people about this, these topics come up time and time again. And they end up saying things like, well, we're living in different worlds. Like they aren't concerned with the same things I'm concerned with. And you begin to understand then, like if you're experiencing a lot of angst or a lot of anxiety, or if you're trying to navigate something that you don't know how to navigate, you're not probably inclined to turn to somebody that you don't think shares the same values that you do. One of the, I think, big caveats that needs to be expressed here is that this is their perception of what religious leaders care about. I don't think this is an objective reality. I wouldn't say that only 51% of religious leaders care about gun reform. I don't actually know what that number is. But the importance in terms of being able to predict or understand why young people are not turning to religious leaders, the importance isn't whether they've accurately assessed the degree to which religious people care about each of these issues. The importance is that this is how they perceive the world. There's an old saying in my field of sociology, in my discipline, that which people perceive as real is real in its consequences. And so if this is the understanding that you have of the world, of course you're not turning to these people. Lily explains it here, not through a values perspective, but through an experience perspective.
Young people don't feel that churches value the same things as them. And they don't, like for me, I don't feel like the things going on in my life, I can turn to a religious leader and they'll understand, because a lot of the Catholic leaders and such don't go through the same things I do. So that's kind of where I saw the disconnect within myself. And I think a lot of young people, especially Gen Z, kind of take it upon themselves to find what works for them, and they do it by themselves at their own time, and they're not doing it with an organization. Communities that I'm part of, dance, school, the worries that I have, the things that cause my own uncertainty, I don't see religious leaders kind of understanding that or facing the same things.
So Lily is one of our, she's one of what's in this program called the Springtime Ambassadors Program. And these are the young people we meet with monthly, and you're going to hear from a couple of more of them as we move on. But I think Lily has this really nice way of saying it. Like, I mean, she's young and she's trying to, like, if you don't get what the pressures are like in my life, like I don't assume that you would. And if you're not demonstrating that you do, then you're probably just not even on my radar, essentially. Ethan, then talking about this through not just activities, but through identities, puts it this way. He says, I'm gay, and I know that the conservative Christian community doesn't necessarily support people who are LGBTQ+. And a lot of the beliefs were written by members of the religion who don't necessarily respect these people. And so it's made me question to what extent I can really trust that this is what I should believe, that it is ethical or proper. And for that reason, I've kind of lost faith, because I just feel like there's not a lot of trust I can place in the religion when there's a lot of hypocrisy and contradictions. So Ethan is pulling out sort of some very common and tried and true sources of frustration with religious people, but through his own experience, lens, and identity, which makes him even more personal. Oscar, another one of our ambassadors, I think has this really great way of summing up that particular kind of exclusion.
I think that's the most interesting aspect of all of this, because that's a trend that I've seen in our generations through a lot of different things, just like a distrust of institutions, corporations, governments, whatever. But religion kind of has a special place in that, right? Because it permeates everything else. It's like something that applies to all of life, whereas governments are particular things, corporations are particular things, but religion's kind of like in all of it. So it has a much greater effect, I guess, or influence on every aspect of life. And if you feel excluded, then you feel that exclusion that much more in an institution.
Do you hear that last part? Like Oscar's, I think, saying this so well, saying like it's not the same as being left out at school, although that wouldn't be great. And it's not the same as being left out in politics, although that wouldn't be great. When you're left out of or excluded by religious institutions, it's more damaging, because that's the thing that cuts through all of the other things. Young people told us this in interviews all the time without being able to necessarily identify it in exactly the way Oscar has, that it calls into question your own self-worth, because you're trying to reject an entire belief system or trying to figure out if you should reject an entire belief system that has rejected you, or doesn't understand you, or doesn't seem to be making an attempt to know you. Instead seems to be really concerned with making sure that you know them. It's a tough place to be than just saying like, oh, I don't feel welcome at work, right? None of those are great. But as Oscar points out, this has a more pervasive effect. So what happens then is that we've got young people standing over here. They don't even know how to engage sometimes with the faith community. Even when they recognize that they're asking religious questions, they don't even know how to get to religious answers. 51% of young people say that they don't know how to get connected to a faith community, even if they'd like to. 40% of the young people who identified as very religious, so they check the box saying that they're very religious, less than half of them told us that they found connecting with their faith community helpful during challenging or uncertain times. So again, this is just the people who are like fervent believers, very religious, and even they are not finding their communities to be helpful navigating uncertainty. And almost 50% of young people tell us that they don't turn to faith communities due to a lack of trust, which you've already seen earlier. Essentially, if you wrap all of this up, what have we got? Well, we've got a whole bunch of young people saying, gosh, it would be really great to be connected to somebody who could help me get through these times, but I'm not doing it over there. I'm not doing it in those religious settings for this whole host of reasons. Some of them, again, may be objectively true, may not be objectively true, but subjectively, that is their perception and that is governing their feelings. Almost like metaphorically what they're saying is like, I'm interested in this conversation. I still have high rates of belief. I'm still interested, as we saw even last year, like there's high levels of prayer and spirituality and all kinds of things. And I need you, but I'm just not willing to walk across that threshold, real or metaphorical, of your church or your mosque or your campus ministry, of your Bible study, etc. And we've got on the other side of that divide, I think, a whole bunch of religious institutions and systems that care genuinely and deeply about the lives of young people. And the people who staff those places want nothing more than to connect with young people. But we've built those systems for a world that has high institutional trust, where people are relatively connected and life is somewhat predictable. In other words, the opposite of the world that young people inhabit now. And so it's basically like we're sitting on the other side of that divide saying, like, we've got everything for you that you could possibly want, where we would love to chat with you. We definitely want to meet you. I want to know more about you. I genuinely care about your well-being. All you have to do is just walk across the threshold of this door. You see what I'm saying? Like, we've got a whole bunch of young people saying, the one thing I don't want to do is this, and a whole bunch of like well-meaning adults saying, basically, we've constructed the system so that you get access to all this as soon as you do that one thing. And I don't think that's young people's job. That's not incumbent upon teenagers to figure out how to make that transition. It's our job. It's adults' job to do that work. And we are often just not doing that work. We talked about the pandemic earlier. We surveyed young people in the opening weeks of the pandemic, the opening weeks, like it's a premiere of a movie, in the first weeks of the pandemic. And we were startled to learn that in those first weeks of lockdowns, 2% of young people had been reached out to by a religious leader. And so we were so concerned by that number that we figured we better check back in on it a year later. So we surveyed then again in February of this year, 2021, and asked young people the same question. Again, they could check all that apply here. If anyone outside your home has reached out to you personally, who was it? And only 10% of young people told us that they had been reached out to personally by a faith or religious leader. That's not bridging the divide. Like that's not going to get us across the disconnect. In response to this, then, where young people feel like they are trying to do religious work without religious guides and with systems that they cannot trust, they have developed what we call this faith unbundled. And faith unbundled is one of the big themes that we explore in the State of Religion and Young People this year. And as their faith gets unbundled, it looks differently. What does it look like to unbundle belief from a single source or system? Well, it looks like young people who turn to many or various sources when making meaning and discerning what to believe about right and wrong, purpose and calling, salvation and suffering, and more. It looks like curiosity. It looks like curiosity. This is a hallmark of how young people are thinking about faith. If you're not allowed to be curious, encouraged to be curious, then they're not seeing that as authentic faith exploration. But of course, faith is just more than belief. Faith implies practice as well. And what does it look like to unbundle practices from a single source or system? Well, it looks like young people who blend various rituals and behaviors to suit and make sense of the current questions that they are facing. It looks like flexibility. So a lot of the rituals that we may think of as being deeply connected to questions that people ask in their lives, young people might not necessarily see those rituals and make that connection, but they are interested in rituals and practices. They are interested in bringing things together. We wrote an article that some of you may have seen. It was in the Washington Post over the summer. And the whole time I used to I had this very containered version of faith, thinking that oh, of course, some young people are into things like tarot card reading and crystals, and some young people are into institutional religion like Christianity or Islam or what have you. And what we wrote about, because what our data are actually showing is that it's not crystals or Christianity, it's crystals and Christianity, which is fascinating and maybe troubling to some of you on this call. But it's not. This unbundled faith for young people means the combination of practices. And when we start looking at the other aspects of faith lives that are being removed from a single source or system, one of those is community. So what does it look like to unbundle community from a single source? Well, it looks like young people who show up where trusted personal relationships exist or new ones seem possible. Young people who are willing to forego participation in communities lacking those qualities, even if they have had long-term associations with those communities. It looks like connection. The communities are fine, but for faith exploration, communities tend to be relatively homogenous, and what young people are looking for is connection to others. And of course, a lot of this runs through and connects with the most diverse generation that's ever existed, and one for whom diversity, equity, and inclusion are not just things that resonate with them personally, but they are of their highest values, as we explored in meaning making. And what does it look like then to unbundle identity from a single source or system? Instead of just saying I am X or I am Y, breaking all those things apart, it looks like young people who are unwilling to shed parts of themselves so that they can fit into a prescribed narrative about who and how and what to be in the world. It looks like wholeness. And it looks like Zaina. Let's hear Zaina talk about Faith Unbundled.
Due to Gen Z's awareness of social issues, specifically like awareness of the issues within a lot of institutions and a lot of churches and things like that, it kind of makes us less open to the idea of being a part of these institutions. I think a lot of like being a part of like a religious institution or a church or like a mosque or something like that for our parents was kind of more of like a generational thing, and we're kind of breaking away from that and forming our own sense of morality and our own faith based off of our experience, just kind of living and hearing other people's experiences. For me personally, like kind of grabbing different parts of different religions. I know a lot of other people because they kind of talked about that too. And kind of mixing religions or like moral codes from different religions or bases, like different, like just basic principles from a lot of different religions or a lot of different spiritualities. I think Gen Z specifically is doing that a lot more often and kind of creating like their own faith. And I think spirituality varies. Every young person you're going to talk to, you're going to get a different answer about what they believe in.
That's some really complicated stuff Zaina is trying to work through in there, and she's doing such a nice job of explaining what Faith Unbundled means to her. And I think that much of what Zaina is saying there, if you are a faith or religious leader on this at this presentation today, could be really troubling. If you think that Zaina's faith life is static, if you think that 14-year-olds end up having the same faith at 24 and 34 and 54, then you might be very concerned by some of the things that she's saying there about mixing and matching, especially assembling that faith without guides to help her do it. But when we remember that, again, the hallmark of being young is exploration, I think you can let go a little bit of the need to funnel Zaina into the box or the space that you would like her to be immediately, and understand that what she's trying to do is figure all this out, to navigate and find a way through this. And that's important. It means taking young people really seriously, and also understanding that their lives are full of upheaval and change and exploration simultaneously, doing those things together. In practice, then, we see young people engaging in a whole lot of things that rise to the level of spiritual significance to them. Listening to music, spending time with friends, family, caring for pets, and being outdoors, which wouldn't necessarily normally fall into the realm of transcendent behaviors, are often described by young people as those kinds of things. And traditional, quote unquote, traditional things might not. Carrie says, I think I can still believe in God without having to go to church all the time. I don't think going to church is a bad thing, but I don't think it's the end all be all. And we ask young people, specifically, how often did you engage in these kinds of things as religious practice? We saw much higher rates than even I would have guessed. So 53% saying that they're doing art as religious practice, weekly or more often. That 45% say prayer, that makes sense. Reading, which could include, of course, scriptures. Practicing being in nature, also really high, really a paramount concern for young people. Engaging in yoga, martial arts, or other physical activity. We have an article coming out soon with Dr. Barber from the Poor People's Campaign about acts of protest as spiritual activity for young people, and the prevalence with which they engage in acts of protest as religious work. When we ask young people how connected, then, in terms of not just breadth, but depth, how connected do you feel with each of the following? Young people who responded moderately or high, feel very connected to the natural environment, more than they feel connected in a deep way to higher power or even to humanistic impulses. But many of them say that they could filter these things through lots of different religions. So half of them say, I feel like I could fit in with many different religions. So leaving aside the, some version of that 53% is of course captured by the number of young people who aren't interested in a religious system at all, with then a very high portion of the remainder who are at least interested in religious systems, thinking like, oh, sure, I could fit in with a lot of these. And so I think, in order to make sense of this, what Faith Unbundled looks like, I was thinking through a metaphor. what is this sort of conceptual anchor that helps me to understand this? And I think might help a lot of us to understand it. And I think there's a version of the world, maybe one that I grew up in, where the most agency that you could exercise as a young person when it came to your faith was maybe not even attendance, like maybe people were dragging you to church, for example. But you could at least choose whether to accept or reject the system that was being handed to you. This is like going to a restaurant and having the waiter just show up with a plate of food. Your only choice there is I'm either going to eat this food or I'm not going to eat this food. That's basically it. And then there's this other thing that happens where, you know, maybe you get some exposure, some understanding, some opportunities and invitations to encounter other religious systems. And then you might start thinking like, oh, I could be Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim. So I could pick, like ordering off of a menu, from a lot of different things. And I think there's a whole lot of us that grew up in that world that would hear the thing that Zaina is saying and hear some of these other statements and think that's where young people are, that they're in this menu ordering stage where they're sort of like piecing together and cobbling the thing that they're going to put on. They're going to substitute fries for onion rings, and they're going to somehow emerge with this meal. I'm killing this metaphor to death, right? But you get the idea. But I don't think that's where young people are at. And I think largely because of that community and connection piece, they are in this other place where it's not so much being handed a meal that you can either accept or reject, or ordering something exactly to your specifications. I think where they're actually at is they're at a dinner party. They're at a potluck where they're engaging with each other, trying to, not just each other in real life, each other online, they're engaging with other places of understanding, other ways of connecting with the divine. And then they're like, all of that is turning into a meal where they're trying lots of different things. And some of it they hate, some of it they love, some of it are new combinations of things that people would never have put together before. And I think that's the best way to really wrap your heads around what's going on in the lives of young people with religion. Okay, but you could also just listen to Acadia, because I think she has a very nice way of putting it too.
I think there's like really beautiful idea of if we all are mixing different religions, like however we feel, then we are sharing religion with oftentimes lots of different people, because now we have multiple religions, so we're more connected to other people, and then it creates like a big web of different connections, and then you can talk to people about this part of your religion, but maybe you can talk to your other friend about this other part. So it's a big, like, it's a web instead of just a individual bubble.
I love that idea of it being a web as opposed to an individual bubble where we're all trying to figure these things out together. I love that idea because I think it's really accurate. I think, as she mentions, it's really beautiful, this idea that people trying to help one another figure this out. What this means that for us as adults then, and we've got some other perspectives in the state of religion and young people that you should definitely check out from actual religious professionals from a variety of different settings and faith traditions. But what I see here as somebody who's a researcher is that the overwhelming thing that we can do is to understand that young people are in this process of exploration. Our job is not to provide them with ultimatums. Our job is to stay in the conversation with them for as long as they'll have you. The longer you're in the conversation, the more you can disrupt maybe some of their preconceived ideas, the more that you can help to shape that conversation that they're having, the more that you can build bonds of trust. As we saw last year, trust for institutions is low, trust for relationships is high. Stay in the conversation for as long as they'll let you be there. And I think this really matters. So doing this work is critical, because what we saw this year is that young people who are religious are flourishing a lot more than young people who are not religious. It doesn't seem to matter what their religion is, but it does seem to matter that they have a religious life that is considered. They're flourishing more at work, at home, in their finances, and their health. They're flourishing everywhere. There's a suicide epidemic among young people, and next year in 2022, Springtide is going to be spending the whole year exploring issues of mental health and faith and religion. And at a very basic level, we can already see this data emerging. I generally feel that what I do in my life is valuable and worthwhile. The very religious have a much stronger sense of agreement with that claim. I think showing up in this way for young people is absolutely vital. Hey everybody, thanks for watching that first section. Now, as we start to think about how to put faith unbundled and some of those things into action, of course, the first experiences that we're going to have are with young people this fall. You've already been having those. Schools have started back up everywhere, obviously now for some time, and we're starting to, we're dealing with a whole bunch of different things depending on where we are in the country, mask mandates, and some people are moving from in person to remote and back, and all those kinds of things. The transition out of the pandemic is not going to be smooth. It is going to be a stop and start kind of situation, and it's going to be herky jerky. We've already, the Delta variant has certainly proven that to be true, and who knows what it's going to look like as we move forward with the holidays coming up, and maybe things even getting better with vaccinations coming for hopefully for younger people, and including hopefully my son soon. So we need to think about, what does that mean for us? How do we recognize that young people are dealing with this massive amount of uncertainty, and yet they're going to be turning to us and coming to us, and hopefully we'll have a chance to guide them, and we're going to be reaching out to them in this period of massive uncertainty, all colored by this pandemic that they're dealing with while dealing with everything else. And so we're going to dive into these 8 exercises in empathy. But before we do that, I want you to, we're gonna open here and then close the exercises in empathy. We're gonna bracket that discussion with clips from young people sort of describing what their pandemic experience is like. And one of the most illuminating things from these videos for me is this notion of time that I think for adults, so often we kept referring, like I kept hearing myself and my friends, we referred to this as sort of like that year that the pandemic was going on. And what young people have told me is, it's not a year, it's so much longer. And you're going to hear that in these videos. That in a world where your life is measured in semesters, it's taken up a gigantic chunk. Not a year, not even a year and a half, but in some ways more. So if we think about it, what that means is that if somebody's right now currently in their junior year of high school, well, that means they got, a few months of normalcy in the first semester or so of their first year of high school, and then that got disrupted, and then all of sophomore year last year was probably online or hybrid or some sort of some kind of chaos. And then coming back to school this year has been, like we just said, a little bit stop and start as well. And so they haven't had a normal year. Might not, depending on what moves forward, might not even get one. And if they do, it's only going to be their senior year. That is. So anyway, watch these videos. I'll try and fade them in and out into the discussion, and then back out to the video, and I'll come back and wrap things up.
And I'm going into sophomore year.
My name is Oscar Noam. I'm 20 years old. I'm a rising junior in college. I just finished my sophomore year.
First off, I'm Abby. I'm 17, almost 18, and I'm going to be a freshman this year in college.
Something that I've noticed that adults don't seem to really understand about our kind of age range is that our time is kind of valued differently for adults. For the most part, like once you have a solid job, you have your own personal life, like things are relatively steadier. Like there will be big life developments, but it's like a grander scheme of things. But for us, you have 4 years in high school, you have 4 years in college, and no matter what year you are, this pandemic has taken up a major chunk of that. Like the time is transitory, and like it's supposed to be like, you always hear like the most important years of your life, but this has already disrupted at least 2 years of it, not taken up 2 years of it, but at least disrupted 2 years of it. And I'm certain that the aftershocks and lingering effects will continue to disrupt what we've expected for all this time. So I don't want to say that it's had more of an effect on young people than adults, but in terms of like, going into college, I expected, certain things, to have kind of like a laid back atmosphere of freedom, to like kind of discern what I wanted to do with my life, to discover who I wanted to be, that kind of thing. But with everything so, shaken up by lockdown and the pandemic and all the restrictions that my university had to go through, like I'm grateful I was still able to, stick through it. But I lost a lot of what I was expecting to experience, and I highly doubt that the remaining time I have here will be, what it would have been if this hadn't happened. And so there's a lot of frustration that comes with that, and just kind of like, I'd say it's the most frustrating part is that it's nobody's fault, really. Like, this just happened, and so I have a lot of frustrations, but there's nowhere to direct them, and so yeah.
The passage of time especially for adults is really different, because like from 0 to 20 is the most change in like the smallest amount of time you'll probably ever go through in your life. And then if you skip out on a year of that, it's way more developmental than maybe skipping out a year in your 30s or 40s or upwards numbers of that. So I feel like, along with obviously like the socialization and activities we get to do and things like that, I think adults can understand most of that because they've been having to do that too. But I think the loss of a whole year looks different to an adult because their timeline is differently structured than a young person's is. Developmentally is huge, just because like growing up a little more, you are starting to understand a little more of who you are, like not totally, but a little more. So missing a whole year, it's big personality shaper. So for me, I guess I have to look at it as like the backstory of some character, where it's like, this is a big moment and I can't just write it off as I lost a year. It's more like losing 1/15 of my life, which is quite a bit. I don't know the percentages because that's a lot of math, but
A lot of the adults I've encountered, I feel like they see it so much from like an economic standpoint, and like I get it, like businesses places are going out of business, or I don't know. All I know is that from my standpoint, because I'm not super into that, because I'm still pretty young and I don't really keep up with like businesses, I guess, but I know that like I miss my friends, and I remember thinking of it from more of like a social standpoint, how like I feel alone and isolated. I miss my friends. I miss my grandma, because I've already been in a digital age. I know how to use my phone and my laptop to communicate. I did that even when I could see my friends. So now that that's my only resort to have social interaction, it just became so draining to always be on my phone or my laptop just to feel fulfilled. Whereas
Is there anything else that you think that that adults would do well to know, that they should hear? You've seen the work that we're doing at Springtide. You've been a part of the ambassadors program discussions. Is there anything else that comes to the top of mind that you would say, like, this would be really important for adults who are coming back in person with kids, for the first time, with young people for the first time in a year and a half, to understand, or to at least have it at the front of their mind?
I think just remember that they have also obviously been going through struggles. This is an everybody thing, but for people, we can't just go back to normal. It's not just a snap and we're okay. It'll take a little bit to build back in, to remember what we didn't really learn, and to like remember how to be in class. It'll take a little bit, I think, and for adults to remember that we are still coming back and not just snap okay.
And these exercises in empathy are designed to help adults put themselves in the place of young people based on the data that we're seeing, so that you can sort of craft a meaningful experience of coming out of the pandemic in a way that is supportive and also re-engages them. Number one, create safety to help young people regain their footing. As you see, the trend here is it's not so much that you should be looking at work as, 22% of young people feel safe coming back to work, and only 18% say church, and only 13%. The overall point here is that everything's pretty low. Young people aren't expressing a whole lot of safety anywhere coming out of the pandemic, and so we shouldn't assume that just because adults are eager and ready to get back to these places, that young people are necessarily going to follow suit in lockstep. Number two, grieve what's been lost, but without dwelling on the negatives. 57% of young people said that when the pandemic is over, I expect that a lot will be different in mostly disappointing ways. So while we may be eager as adults to get sort of back to normal. A lot of what young people have experienced in this last year is that there is no getting back to normal. They just missed things. Adults, many of us, not all of us, but many of us have the ability to sort of walk back into a life that we more or less knew before the pandemic started. But for a lot of young people, those really important life markers, really big events, those kinds of things just completely disappeared. And they're not being replaced with an old version. They're walking into something brand new, because so much of life for a young person is about transition, is about going into new places and new spaces. And they just skipped, in many cases, a lot of these things and are now in wholly new spaces. And that's a little terrifying, right? So we need to find ways to help grieve that loss, right? But without dwelling on the negatives. Similarly, we can celebrate what's been gained, but without insisting on optimism, because there have been real gains during this past year. Young people still got jobs, young people still graduated. I know a lot of times we didn't get to collectively celebrate these events in ritualistic ways like we once did. We shouldn't just say, oh, well, and let those things go without being noticed or marked in some way. And I know that we tried it. I mean, many of us, had drive-by graduation ceremonies. We tried everything we possibly could think of. But there's been some real gains that need to be noticed. But that doesn't mean that everything for those people, even who have gained things, is proceeding, as we say in the research world, up and to the right. If you're thinking about a graph, right? Like, it doesn't mean that everything's perpetually and always getting better. There are going to be bumps in the road. And I think we do well as adults to help young people sort of temper that on both sides, to balance out their lives of like, yes, there have been some things that were lost, and in some cases real, lives lost that we need to acknowledge and understand and help young people make sense of. And there have been some things that have been gained, and we don't want to get too carried away with that, either. What we can do is to help them find balance. And what we've designed here in this book is some ways to help do that. Resist comparison by making space for a range of emotions. So we've got a mixed bag here when we surveyed young people about whether they're going to be ready to engage with the sort of rest of the world. And we had young people telling us they can't wait. We've had young people telling us that they never stopped, frankly. We had young people telling us that they're terrified because they have seen what the virus did to members of their family. And we've had young people tell us that actually, they didn't mind staying home that much, and maybe they just don't actually want to go back to the way things were and re-engage with the rest of the world in the ways that they had to before, for whatever reason. Some of those were just personal. Some of those were around, frankly, negative social experiences that they had and in-person interactions that they didn't have to worry about anymore. So I think we really want to make space for a range of those emotions by noting them, by sort of upholding them, and letting young people know that whatever you're feeling here is okay, and we're going to get through this together. And that's a big part of it, is getting through it together. So get together to combat isolation with intentional gatherings. These intentional gatherings don't have to be big. They can be small. They don't have to be in person. They could be still online in some cases. But the important point is that it's not random, that we are getting people together, that we're not letting young people slip through the cracks. Even once we've accounted for sort of all the young people that would normally come through our orbit, that we're continuing to reach out and dig in and dig in and dig in, because there's going to be a lot of young people that are going to fall through the cracks if we're not intentional about dragging them out. We can't count on young people to know what's always in their own best interests. That's why there's adults in the room like you. Sometimes we have to let them know that, while it may feel safer to stay at home by yourself socially, I don't mean physically, that we can create spaces where they can connect with one another and be supported by the adults who are creating those spaces for them. That's a vital role that you can play, because it's going to be hard to undo some of those patterns that have set in over the last year. But getting together is probably the only way that we're going to be able to do it as appropriate, when it's safe, knowing that just because we get together this week, who knows what's going to happen in the fall. We may be going back to the way things have been for the last year, at least in part, and then coming back together again in person for periods of time. So being flexible, but not letting go of that together piece, because that is how young people make sense of the world. It's how they experience, it's how they understand whether their emotions are sort of in line with what are expected emotions and thoughts and feelings. They have to be in community. A couple of really important things that surprised me that emerged from this study are about taking care of the body to help the mind and body process stress. So nearly 70% of young people told us that they want to keep some of their new routines when the pandemic is over. What was startling to me is how many of them started new routines during the pandemic. So they started cooking, they started running, they started hiking, they started gardening, all kinds of stuff. But almost every one of them, when we asked them to sort of list the most common ones, were very physical embodiments of engaging with the world. So in other words, not so much reading or gaming or these sort of passive activities. Although I'm sort of being hesitant here about gaming because I know that there's a wide range of what counts as gaming. But I think you understand, like, not so much like watching everything in their Netflix queue as they were really doing these physical things. And there's a lot of social science here, a lot of psychology, a lot of social psychology that shows the connection between mind and body and spirit. That this way of being tangibly engaged with the world when you feel disconnected from it can help you to reduce stress, to sort of broaden your holistic picture of the world. And young people told us that they wanted to keep doing those things. We should keep that in mind. And in a way that, is comfortable for you. So, if that means meditation, then you're comfortable leading a meditation class, that's great. If it means, working out and exercising and leading a running club or something like that, that's great. If it means just organizing like walks in nature with young people, I think that that's great too, or cooking classes. But know that young people really want to keep hold of these habits, but also remember what it's like to be a teenager, which is that habits are easy to start maybe, but hard to hold on to. And so while they may desire to do it, they may fade really quickly without the right supports. And they're really important activities to have. The second one of those was about turning to the arts. So nearly 1 in 3 young people want to keep their new practices and new artistic practices of painting, sculpting, or other artistic hobbies. I think we saw a lot of that during the pandemic of people trying to express. And really what this is trying to get out and make sense of the emotions that you're having and the things that you're seeing in the world. And we can do a lot to foster this. Religious groups have not always been great about sort of engaging with the arts in a very robust way or a very sort of authentic way. But a lot of the art that passes for art in religious spaces is art about religious things. But it doesn't have to be that, right? The act of making art can be both therapeutic, but also engaging in a young person's spiritual side as they sort of grapple with the unknown, how to express the ineffable, right? These are basic concepts to any religious practice and core to making art. That's what we see young people really striving for when they're reaching out to try and develop their artistic hand over the last year. And I think we would do well to tap into that. Lastly, then, we can focus on the practical by offering young people concrete help. We didn't want this to go without mention that you can do some things here as adult leaders to help young people get through the pandemic, to sort of recover from it a little bit, to make sense of the world that happened to them. But sometimes the only thing that's going to work is having actual, real counseling professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, et cetera. And if you don't know who those people are in your community, I want to encourage you right now to start figuring out who they are, making relationships with them, figuring out which ones of them are interested or willing to work with you and your group, because you're going to be seeing young people come out of this with a variety of responses. We don't even know yet what those are going to be. And you want to have those resources in your back pocket so you can refer young people when appropriate to those kinds of professionals. We don't want you in over your head trying to give advice or do something that you're not trained or equipped to do, because in some of these cases, seeing a trained professional is the only thing that's going to help. Young people express some very serious concerns throughout this research and throughout a lot of the research we've been doing over the last year that I think would probably test the limits of most adults in their lives that weren't sort of trained clinical professionals in this area. Okay, so that's the end of the bonus content. I really think that we can make a successful transition sort of back into the regular world this fall, but we can't do it if we walk back into young people's lives and pretend like it's, February of 2020 again, and we're just picking up, right in the teaching series about Galatians or whatever, where we left off. I think we've got to walk back in, understanding that our primary job this fall is to, in a very relational way, to help young people make sense of what just happened to them over the last 12 months.
I'm Acadia, and I'm going into sophomore year.
My name is Oscar Noam. I'm 20 years old. I'm a rising junior in college. I just finished my sophomore year.
First off, I'm Abby. I'm 17, almost 18, and I'm going to be a freshman this year in college. gets so draining staring at your computer all day. Like I used to not have to even bring my charger to school because I was barely on my laptop, but my laptop dies after like fourth period, and it's just frustrating that I had to do all my math online. It's like doing calculus on your computer. It's not the same, and like
Yeah.
it's weird that I was actually like missing textbooks, and like I barely even like used a pencil this year. Like it's annoying. So I think that it's like, oh well, they're always online. Like that's, you know, be kind of in that way. Like I'm trying to word it correctly. I don't want like technology and like being online to be my only form of social interaction, and I also hated that was my way of learning. It did not feel very fulfilling to learn through technology solely.
I really like the word that Abby used, fulfilling. There's what I've experienced in the last year and semester and change or whatever, is that my classes and teachers, it's clear that everybody's doing their best to still provide the same level of education, but it's really not the same. There's certain aspects of being in a classroom and having like a direct conversation with a teacher face to face, or being able to interact with other students, you know, have like a side conversation about just like, hey, are you understanding this, or something like that, that aren't really possible online. And there's just like, even if technically speaking, all the capabilities are in the same place, like it's all just a substitute, right? With virtual learning, it's all like, it's serviceable, but it's not the same. And that's what I've really run into. There's certain benefits, to be sure. Like I know guys from my dorm who will wake up like 5 minutes before their first class of the day because it's on Zoom, and they'll just roll out of bed, you know, throw on a hoodie and just drop in. Yeah. So, you know, pretty sweet deal in that end, but it's, yeah, I'm not a fan of it.
Concerns, worries, fears even do you have about returning to sort of normal life in the fall?
So one of the silly little kind of fears is like almost forgetting how to socialize with larger groups of people. Because even in school, I've been with 15 kids at most, where it's like, oh, we're all kind of good buddies because we're stuck with each other. But like the larger group, how to interact in a larger group is, I've kind of forgotten how to do that just a little bit because I haven't had to. And one like other, a little more specific to my age group is, I went through the pandemic through my first year of high school, so I have no idea what actual high school looks like, because my high school experience is sitting at a computer and not paying attention is mostly what most of the high school has been. So like, I have no idea what it's actually going to be like.
What I am very worried about is the social aspect of things. My campus runs very much on traditions, both large and small. And I kind of mentioned how like this time is transitory, and how like even a year, we've talked about like, you know, a year and change is like, it's a big block for people in our generation. And there's certain dynamics that have kind of been skipped over. So like in high school, you know, there's almost like a food chain of, you know, like there's a freshman at the bottom and then sophomores, juniors, seniors. But like what happens when you skip a whole year, right? Like the dynamics kind of get shaken up, and people who were looking forward to, you know, taking on this kind of like mentorship role, or, you know, being able to pick on the underclassmen, you know, they don't get that chance. And this coming year, I'm going to be a junior, and essentially all I've had is one semester of normal college. I had the first semester of my freshman year, and now I'm going to be a junior. And so like the dorm traditions that are so integral to our dorm identity, and then on a grander scale, the university traditions, like the juniors and seniors going to be the only ones who like have actually experienced any of that, because the freshmen came in with no idea of that, and they got like a kind of, you know, half-hearted COVID safe form of that. And we got like some of it, but like not all of it, because even our first year was cut short. So I'm kind of worried about how all that will shape up, how traditions will change, what might get lost. Um, I guess, how would I liken it? It's like you have to, you know, it's like we need a social defibrillator or something like that. Like everything's completely been shut down and died out, but you need to like jumpstart it. And I'm wondering if like people are going to be equipped or like have, you know, the memory of things or the knowledge to, you know, go back to the way things used to be, or if it's just going to be kind of like, you know, hesitant, stumbling, figuring out new things. So on one hand, that could mean like a bunch of new traditions, which could be pretty cool. But I mean, I kind of was looking forward a lot to the way things used to be. So we'll see, I guess.
For me, I'm nervous socially, I guess. I mean, I'm afraid because I live, it's kind of give or take in New Orleans. Like a lot of people tend to be more progressive and are vaccinated, but there are still a lot of people who are just like very anti-vax, and I'm afraid of the people who are going to try to fake it, especially since New Orleans is such a hot spot for like tourists. Like I saw during the pandemic, like people would post on Snapchat or something of them on Bourbon Street, and it's like March where people weren't really getting like vaccinated like heavily yet, and like seeing people congregate in huge crowds now that we've been through a whole pandemic still makes me really nervous. So I think about like especially being in college, like parties or people congregating. Mardi Gras is what's really getting me kind of like, I'm thinking about Mardi Gras because I've grown up going to parades, and the more I think about it, I'm like, wow, this is gross. Like it's fun, but it's dirty and it's gross. And then so like we didn't have it this year, but I'm sure we'll be back on track for next year, right? But there's still gonna be those people who don't want to get vaccinated. There's still gonna be people who come in from other states, maybe other countries. I don't know how popular Mardi Gras really is, but it gets really packed and really congregated, and it makes me very nervous. Last year for my birthday, I actually had COVID and I did not get to celebrate it. So I'm thinking this year is my 18th birthday. I want to do something fun, but like I don't know how big. I'm probably gonna not have that many people over anyway. But still, when I'm inviting them, if you're not vaccinated, wear a mask.
All right, everybody, that's what I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening to all this content. You can find everything that I talked about today is free. Thanks to generous donations from family foundations, we work really hard to raise a lot of money here at Springtide to make sure that we can put as much stuff out into the world for free as possible. And that's a big component of our mission. You can get this the state of religion in young people both last year's, if you're interested in the concept of relational authority, we dive into that, and this year's. If you're interested in faith unbundled and navigating uncertainty, those are both available on our website in digital edition for free. You can get them, as I mentioned, in print on Amazon or our own website at a very, very low cost just to cover printing and shipping. And then, of course, the new normal is a workbook that is free in digital form, or I think a very low cost 5-pack bundle if you want to work through it with your teams on our website. All right, I'm really excited to get to join you live and workshop some of these things here real soon, like in a week or so. So we'll get a chance to chat. All right, thanks everybody.